Aloha mai kako. Greetings to one and all. Thank you for joining this webinar series, which is a prelude to the American Association for Geographers conference in Honolulu to be held April of 2024. This is our fourth in a series of webinars that we have put on, and it's been my pleasure to host this series. I'm Neil Hannes, and I have a company called Ho'okele Strategies here in Honolulu. And I've been retained by the American Association for Geographers to help engage with our local community and the talent. And we're really fortunate today that we have two really fine, talented members of our community who are putting on this webinar. It's the fourth of these webinars, and we began with a sense of coming into space and place with intentionality and an understanding of host and guest responsibilities and relationship. We then went through a Hawaiian worldview in our second of creation in our second webinar. And last webinar, the third one, we started talking about the impact of human habitation, both in traditional times, pre-contact by Polynesian ancestors, as well as Westerners who came here beginning in the 18th century. We're going to continue that discussion as we watch what was happening and as we endure effects of changes to our climate and so forth, at a really exciting movement that's going on in Hawaii today that's kind of recalibrating and trying to bring and restore Hawaiian values and worldview to the active management of our lands and resources. And I'm very pleased that we have today to do so. Lead us in this discussion, excellent thought leaders, Rosie Alegado, who's a professor of oceanography at the University of Hawai Manoa Sea Grant program, and Kawika Winter, who is the resource manager for the National Estuarine Reserve Research. I get my R's mixed up, Kawika, but you can clarify this when you introduce
Research Reserve, yes.
Research Reserve. So I'm going to turn it right over to them. They have a really exciting presentation today, and I'll go off screen shortly and just leave it to them. We'll come back. We encourage members who are watching, go to your chat and insert questions as you have them, and we're going to leave time at the end, as much time as we need, to try and get to as many of those questions as we can. So if you have questions, you want to bring in analogs or situations from elsewhere around the globe that maybe that you can compare to the content that's delivered today, we welcome that discussion. So without further ado, Rosie, please introduce yourself and then start with your presentation.
Aloha mai kako. Mahalo, Uncle Neil. I'm going to get started by sharing my screen. So let's hope that it works. It worked earlier today. And I just want to check before getting started. Do you guys see a black screen? Thumbs up?
Yes, we do. Yes, I see one.
Okay, I'm going to start by orienting you to who I am. I'm going to be sharing my mo'okuahau, my genealogy that weaves together the people and places that make who I am. O Louise a Oiwang Kong McGregor no Waihe'e, Noho ya Daniel Kalona McGregor no Kalua Nui, Hanau o Daniel Pamoaho McGregor e Lua Hikani. O Daniel Pamoaho McGregor no Kalua Nui, Noho ya Anita Valerie Branco no Laupa Hoi Hoi, Hanau o Deviana Pomaikai he Wahine. O Deviana Pomaikai McGregor no Kaiwi Ula Kapalama, Noho ya Dean Tiborsho Alegado no Zambales, Philippines. Hanau o Rosie Anoleni he Pula Pula. O Waiale'e o Ahu Ku'u Kulaiwi, o Ahui Manu Kahalu'u Ku'u Aina, o Ka'ua Po'ai Hale Ku'u Vai, o Pu'u Ma Eli Eli Ku'u Pu'u o Laloa. Aloha. So just wanted to recognize all of my ancestors, their places, as I bring them here and share all of them with you today. The theme of my section is going to be called Mauli au Honua. And I'd really like to talk about centering Kanaka well-being and readapting to climate change. And Mauli au Honua is a term that refers to a person who has been on a land for a very long time. It's a person with multi-generational knowledge of this place. Mauli refers to native. Au can refer to an epoch of time as well as tides, and Honua means the earth. So when you put that all together, it's really about how we learn and have this knowledge so that we can adapt to whatever the future holds for us. I want to get started by talking about some cultural norms throughout Moana Nui around sustainability that we carried through that have become really central to our values and our identity. And then I want to talk about what is Aina, what is not Aina, and our kinship to Aina as a foundation for a lot of the values that we can really carry forth. And so, talk about climate change and how I think Native people, island people, so Indigenous Pacific Islanders in particular, while we are often seen through the lens of being victims and passive people, I think that if we kind of recenter who we are and our identity, I think we can see that we have a lot of the solutions that others can draw from. So just as a reminder, I know this was covered, so I'm going to go briefly, but perhaps you can indulge me as I take an oceanographic or an oceanographer's point of view. Really, the spread of Polynesian Micronesians into the vastness of the Pacific Ocean is one of, to me, the greatest dramas of human history, right? So beginning over 3,000 years ago, people began to spill out of the chains of Indonesia, Melanesia, and the Philippines into these scattered atolls and volcanic islands. And by about 1000 AD, most of the habitable islands of of the world's greatest and most ancient ocean supported thriving populations. I'm always taken by the speed of this expansion. And, humans then touched almost every speck in the Pacific. What I'm showing you here is actually based on linguistic similarity. There are so many facets with which you can really support this knowledge of our wayfaring and our knowledge. And to that, basically, I just want to say in order to do this, our Indigenous ancient Pacific Islanders had to be oceanographers. This is the va'a. It is the central object of Polynesian culture. Without it, there would be no Pacific Islanders. And that's why our legacy of voyaging is so super crucial. And I'm going to touch back about how this point of view of moving into spaces and that we're really connected. Our island view is not that we're separated as tiny dots that are separated by the ocean, but we're actually connected by the ocean. And the va'a, the sailing canoe, is how we get to those spaces. In order for us to get to those spaces, though, we really had to utilize scientific knowledge. So I just wanted to, again, I'm an oceanographer. I'm like, one of those physical scientists. I really want to emphasize the parallels between contemporary and Indigenous knowledge and knowledge making. This is kind of a short version of the scientific method, the Western scientific method. And I want to really emphasize the strong argument that Indigenous knowledge making follows a very similar path. It's not exactly commensurable, but there are certainly crosswalks between them. Both systems of knowledge utilize empiricism and observation in order to then make predictions and models from which we then manipulate our natural environment. We experiment what works, what didn't. There's testing, there's replication to prove to ourselves that what we are seeing, some of that knowledge is multi-generational. Some of that is like, we just went out this morning and got it. Then once we have that knowledge about the natural world, about that system, how do we embed that knowledge in society at large, as well as more esoterically? Western society, unfortunately, has really narrowed how it has spread that knowledge through journals and articles. We know as academicians, this is what we're publishing. But for many of the Indigenous peoples of the world, and certainly for Native Hawaiians, we embedded this knowledge at many different levels, in chants, in songs, in stories, in myths, and in legends, because this knowledge was really important and applicable to everyday life. So it was extremely important that the dissemination of that happened quickly. I want to share with you one example of that right now. This is a voyaging chant. This is actually the chant of Makua Kaumana. I have a special place in my heart for Makua Kaumana because Makua Kaumana came from Kahiki, came from Tahiti, when Pa'au, who is a really ancient priest who brought a lot of our structures to Hawaii came. Makua Kaumana actually ends up in the place where my family is from. And so that's why Makua Kaumana has a very special place in my heart. So when Pa'au invites a chief to come and live in Hawaii, Makua Kaumana comes along. when they come upon Hawaii, he makes several observations. This was a land that was found in the ocean. It was thrown up from the sea. You can see that there is knowledge that is embedded in the metaphor and in the poetry of this. So that, it was thrown up from the sea. There is knowledge that these islands were volcanic. They were made, as opposed to they were just there and we came upon them, like you see in the continental settings, from the very depths of Kanaloa, the white coral caves. There was caught the hook of the fishermen, the great fishermen of Kapa'ahu, Kupu Heʻeia Nu'u. They touch the shore, come aboard, possess Hawaii, the island is Hawaii. And so you can see that there's this hypothesis that even before the islands, that long ago there was only the ocean, and that the islands are somehow born. They arise and they appear out of the sea. So right there, implicit in that, we already have the theory of, plate tectonics. So I think it's really amazing that this kind of knowledge that was brought across the ocean, because our people came from other places where there are volcanoes, and they reapplied and they recentered that knowledge to see how could it be specific to what I'm using. They applied that and created new hypotheses that are embedded in these chants that are hundreds of years old. And so really important to that, I want to return to this canoe imagery. There is a saying called Hewa'a he moku, he mo'u moku hewa'a. The canoe is an island and the island is a canoe. And this highlights, actually, when you're on the canoe, look at that. Look at the canoe. It's the only thing that's out there in the middle of the ocean. That means that on this island that is the boat, the resources are finite. And that is actually correctly true of the finite resources of Pacific Islands as it is on a canoe. So the contemplation of our island resources and applying canoe knowledge to island spaces means that you necessarily have to be a good environmental steward, right? We're prompted then to think about the ways that we need to work together as a community to best steer our canoe in the right direction. Right? Everybody has a function, everybody has to fulfill that function because we have a collective destiny, a collective future together. So the island is a canoe, but the canoe is also an island. And that kind of thinking is the kind of Polynesian, not just Hawaiian thinking that was brought and kind of tailored as our people came across the Pacific. When we got to Hawaii, we no longer necessarily just use the word moku, which means boat, right? We now develop this new concept called aina. And I'm going to give you this word because we're going to be seeing it. And I apologize for the resolution. This comes from one of our great Hawaiian scholars, David Malo from Kamaʻolelo, Hawaii in 1898, where he really gives this distinction of there is a difference between the word moku and the word aina. And he said the ancients gave names to the natural features according to their ideas of fitness for ability to have kanaka or people live on them. One was moku, the other was aina. As separated from other islands by the sea, we use the word moku. So you might hear the word moku, the transliteration is motu. Tuamotus, you hear it in Tahiti, you hear it all across the Pacific. But as it was the stable dwelling of men, it was called aina, because aina is the word that which feeds. And I'm just repeating it, but I'm sure that the other presentations have presented that. But that idea of it is the dwelling place of man, it is stable. Why is it stable? What is man's relationship to aina that makes this place? Man have to be there. If there are no kanaka or people on a place, it's not aina. That's what makes it aina. And so there is this really unbreakable relationship and connection to people. Again, I'm just going to blast through this because I'm sure that the other presentations have done a fabulous job. But the reason why aina and human and people on it are inseparable is because we have kinship to these spaces, right? Our natural resources, people often in the Western context call them natural resources. Our natural resources are our cultural resources. And that is because we put ourselves within the natural cycle of the history of the earth. We see ourselves as the living descendants of Papa, who is Earth Mother, and Wakea, who is Sky Father. I'm not going to go into detail about this, but as also an evolutionary biologist, what I will say is that literal or is that metaphoric? I would actually say it's literal. We evolved from single-celled organisms that in turn evolved and came out of, literally just like carbon, sulfur, nitrogen. And so indeed correct, yes, and oxygen. Indeed correct, yes. We did literally arise from the earth and the sky 3.3 billion years ago as the first living cell, and then evolved through time to where we are today. I'm not going to go too much into detail about this because I think Kawika is going to cover this more in detail. But, there within the genealogy of Papa and Wakea is Haloa, which is our kalo plant. Haloa is seen as the original ancestor of the Hawaiian people. Haloa was the child of Wakea and Ho'ohoku Kalani. And before Haloa the man, Ho'ohoku Kalani birthed a stillborn child, Haloa, and they planted or they canoed Haloa, the stillborn child, and where he was buried, a kalo plant grew. And so the kalo is referred to as Haloa. And then the second child is also Haloa, named after their older brother. And so kalo the plant is our older brother. And that therefore lays the foundation and the identity of our kinship responsibilities to Earth. And in fact, Aina is an integral part of the identity of who Native Hawaiians are. I always find it incredibly informative and instructive that if you look at the parts of the kalo plant, there are so many important words to our foundational society that are there. The ha is the stem of the plant that refers to our essence, our life force. The pua is the flower that also refers to our descendants. The piko, which is where the stem joins the leaf, or the lau, refers to our umbilicus. The oha, which is an offshoot of it, when you have, and the keiki or the child kind of grow around it, that central parental root is called the makua, which is the word for parent in Hawaiian society. The keiki are the children. When you gather them all together, it's called the ohana or the family unit. And so with just by studying the parts of this plant, the parts of Haloa, you can really understand the working and the infrastructure of the fabric of the Hawaiian society. So as I said, these are things that are kind of normalized cultural norms that unite many of us across Moana Nui Akea, which is known as the Pacific now. But what really defines us as Native Hawaiians, I just want to say we came as Polynesians, we adapted to our environment, we made mistakes, and we evolved, just as we are doing now and as we have to continue to do. And what really defines us is the system that we developed to sustain ourselves in perpetuity. So, I'm just going to blast through these again. No early Native Hawaiians trace ancestry to early Polynesians. We know about initial settlements when canoe loads of families were arriving from the Marquesas. For those of you who are kind of nerdy buffs, you can look up the genealogies. We know about how long ago this was because we have oral genealogies to support this information, generations 1 through 111 from Paliku to Wakea. But I don't want to sugarcoat it. I don't want to make it seem like it was all hunky-dory. We know that this initial human settlement also came with the introduction of organisms that led to ecological disruption, the Polynesian rat, and possibly the pig, and of course us humans as well, right? But this is the part where these are the values that make us specifically Hawaiian. We adapted, using that scientific process that I briefly went over, we employed that, we executed that in order to unite our spiritual beliefs and practices to protect these fragile island resources. And so making mistakes, but learning from them is also a critical part of this perpetuity. And I can best encapsulate this in the term aloha aina, which very kind of cursorily, I will translate to aloha meaning love, affection, and aina meaning the land. Really though, I want to say that when I hear the word aloha aina, there are many different layers depending on time and context. The practice for caring of the land and resources, also honoring life's spiritual forces, and through your demeanor and manner that is respectful. So you aloha aina, you aloha kekahi, you love one another. And then you aloha ina kupua, you show affection, respect, and love to native deities or the native natural elements. And when you have this unity of balance, humans, nature, and deity, that really is the core of Native Hawaiian beliefs. These are then built into these traditional land systems to provide the stewardship of the natural resources as well as the ocean. And the stewardship really ensures survival because the land, it feeds us, it's giving the food, shelter, recreation, economic livelihood, but it is also the source of our mana or spiritual strength. At this point in time, though, we have to do like a quick because we then have contact with the West. And what that does is it creates these waves of colonialism. I'm drawing here not from a picture of Hawaii, but from elsewhere, because what you literally have then when you have these forces coming together is geographic displacement, right? The colonialism is a form of domination in which at least one society is trying to exploit some set of benefits that are believed to be found in another territory, right? These waves of colonialism, displacement is the first wave. Psychological and social kind of displacement and erasure is like the second wave of colonialism. And what I'm showing you here are images from Hawaii of the ways in which European and then United States colonialism and then imperialism really imposed on Hawaiian society. So we had language suppression and forced assimilation. We had conversion to Christianity. We had overthrow of our governance system by illegal overthrow that was supported by the US Navy to kind of support colonial capitalism, really sugar. We had extreme militarism and expansion. We had martial law in Hawaii during World War II, and now we have tourism. So we have these inundations, these waves of social and psychocultural colonialism. But it wasn't only met. Now you had this beautiful system. What happened to it? Yes, our governance system was overthrown, but there were strong elements of aloha aina that still pervaded. One of the ones that we can really draw to is the Hui Aloha Aina movement, or in response to the illegal overthrow, Hawaiian Patriotic League, which was named the Hui Aloha Aina, really kind of came to fruition. So as I said, at different time points and contexts, this term aloha aina comes to have different meanings. So the people who are aloha aina and who practice aloha aina become seen as nationalists, and they have a very strong sense of patriotism. And so aloha aina becomes this multi-layered meaning that, yes, it's someone who cares for the land so much, and they are someone who cares for their nation, because these are inseparable. And I just want to kind of drop a little Easter egg, because you're going to see it later, is that really key to this two figures are Joseph and Emma Navahi, and their writings and their activism really come back and still serve us today as being really, really inspirational. But it didn't stop there. We are now in what I kind of think of as the third wave of colonialism, which is really the destruction, the like physical destruction now, not just displacement, but the destruction. So the first would be displacement for extractive purposes. The second would be psychocultural. The third is destruction of our natural cultural resources. Peoples indigenous to these places will be forced to move not as the result of extraction, but because the most technologically advanced societies on the planet have built their modern day lifestyles on a carbon energy foundation. I'm showing you here images from across the state of Hawaii, as well as some of the other most extreme areas of our planet that are experiencing the effects of climate change. And we see a lot of how the West sees the Pacific, right? If a country sinks beneath the sea, is it still a country? Does that mean that we disappear as a people? I see our Pacific Island nations really facing big questions regarding how they want to manage their future. And what I think is really important to understand is that continental mentalities don't work in these spaces. They don't work in island nations. I'm not the first one to say this. I'm just repeating, what the people of the Pacific are I'm just trying to elevate their voices. I want to just really briefly talk about what are some of the specific changes that we expect to see in Hawaii. I'm not going to talk about the global climate disaster. You all know that. But in Hawaii, we know that it's getting hotter. This is just some data from our Hawaii temperature index that we are seeing slow increases over the decade. We also know that our rainfall is decreasing. It's been decreasing about 6% per decade. All of these, of course, will have impacts on our natural environment. In addition to the rainfall decreasing, our stream base flow is also decreasing. So what I'm showing you here, the pink triangles are the sites around which we've been looking at stream flow, annual meeting stream flow, and we're seeing a not huge, but quite steady decrease over time. All of that translates to a decrease in the recharge capacity of our groundwater. And on Oahu, at least, 95% of our drinking water comes from groundwater. So we are very concerned because climate change will have an impact on our baseline ability to maintain life on this island. To that, of course, we know that the seas are rising. So we are getting less fresh water to recharge, and we are getting inundated by the ocean. Just want to kind of give you a quick picture. This is where you may be coming in a couple of months. This is an aerial shot of Waikiki. Ala Moana is in the foreground. Waikiki's in the background. Of course, the iconic diamond head, or as we call it, Le'ahi. So the idea is the sea is going to be coming in, but because of the nature of the geology of our islands, we are also seeing inundation from below. Okay, I just want to give you a quick snapshot of that image. Now look at it from above. Okay, what are we looking at? What can we potentially expect? We can probably expect 1 foot in the next, oh my gosh, when I first started talking about these lectures, it was 20 years ago. Now it's like 7 years from now, 7 to 17 years from now. In yellow, you can see where the saturated spaces are, and blue are what's going to be flooded. By 2050, we're kind of predicting an intermediate, this is under the intermediate high scenario that's kind of put forth by the IPCC. This is what we can expect. And by 2060 to 2070, this is what 3 feet or 1 meter of sea level rise will look like. So we really have to drastically redefine these tourist areas, these high economic revenue areas, to something else. And perhaps it's a return to what they actually were, which is wetlands. And of course, in another several decades, it will be wetlands, whether or not we want to think about it or not. I forgot, my animation went even further. So you can see that this is really striking. For those of you who have been to Hawaii, who've been to Waikiki, it's gonna be gone. I mean, maybe Magic Island will still be there at the end, and Kaka'ako will still be there. But literally, we will have to build bridges to get to the more main islands. And of course, with that comes coastal erosion. And basically, our natural ecosystems, unless we really take care, are going to go weak and vulnerable under these new climate scenarios. And I just want to say this is not necessarily directly having to do with climate change, but of course, the introduction of a number of invasive species will begin to tip that balance and just make things a lot more difficult. We've seen a number of tropical cyclones. In 2015, 2016, we had an El Nino, and just in this one picture, it's just astounding. Hawaii is on the left side. We can see 4 storm systems. And whereas in the past, Hawaii was really protected by our trade wind belt, the breakdown of that because of changes to the global weather stream mean that we are more likely to be hit and be in the path of these really damaging storms. So we're looking at stronger, more frequent storm systems passing through. This is an example of what that might look like, the El Nino of 2015, 2016. It is both like confusing because is it going to get wetter or is it going to get drier? Is it going to, it's both. Not only did we have 11 days of record-setting rainfall, at the same time, we had 24 days of record heat. And we had 9 months of drought. So it's not like it's like one or the other. It's that in 1 year, everything's just getting more and more extreme. We had larger winter waves. We had marine heat waves. We had chloral bleaching. And all of this are just the impacts to our natural environment. Could this be a glimpse of the future? I know it's getting dark. Don't worry, there's some positivity coming soon. I'm going to keep you going a little bit more. One more slide on this darkness. What I showed you was the impacts to the environment, but we really have to look at it holistically because although the Western society separates man from the environment, as Hawaiians, we do not. As Pacific Islanders, we do not. So yes, there is environmental degradation, extreme heat, severe weather. We have to look at the holistic picture of how one impacts the other. We are intertwined with our environment. So we have to worry about water and food supply. We have to worry about changes in disease. We have to worry about how we're going to have increased allergens and different kinds of potential diseases, as well as exacerbating the already existing social inequities and vulnerabilities of different communities. So, geez, what the heck are we going to do? What should we do? Well, I think that the course that we're going on, if we kind of really invest in the Western society, hasn't taken us to a great place. So I'm going to offer up an alternative. And I have to start and place that within a Hawaiian framework. Not all knowledge is held in a single school. So there are different schools of knowledges. We have Western knowledge system. We also have the Hawaiian knowledge system. And I think it's time in Hawaii, we give it a better go. And I think elsewhere more broadly, we give it a better go. A lot of people have called them nature-based solutions, but let's be real, those nature-based solutions are really indigenous solutions. So I think it's really time that we recognize, I think a lot of the climate anxiety comes from the idea that, oh my God, Western society is ending. Let me just be really real right now and say that for indigenous peoples, we've already seen the end of some of our societies. We've already seen the apocalypse and we're still here and we're still surviving and we haven't given up. And I think it's in that resilience of not giving up in the face of colonialism is why we potentially are more positive in our outlook than others, because we've already had our genocide. So perhaps it is the end of Western society and the beginning of something else. That means that we have to readjust Western ideas, Western myths about conservation and preservation. This is one of the foundational myths of America's conservation kind of ethos, right? The national park system, the preservation of pristine wilderness, places that were supposedly devoid of habitants. And this is why I showed that picture in the beginning. That picture kind of really harkens to the displacement around the native inhabitants, that were supposedly saved so that we could have this unaltered paradise. It's a falsehood. And when we don't have people there, we don't have stewards of the land. So how does this translate to Hawaii? There's a really, one of my favorite sayings is "Ikawama mua, ikawama hope." So the Hawaiian, in order to look to the future, stands with their back to the past. And I'm not saying that we're backwards. I'm saying that we look to what has happened. We don't forget. We are not trying to fool ourselves that we are perfect or exceptional or make no mistakes. We look to the words of our kupuna to help and guide us about what we should do to the future. And this saying that by Lili Kalakam Elehiva, it says that the Hawaiian stands in the present with its back to the future, not to be backwards, not to be a Luddite, but to seek historical answers for present day dilemmas. So I know I'm going over time, but I just want to give one example of how I think we can look to historical patterns. So as an oceanographer, as a Hawaiian, I've been really interested in how practitioners have interpreted global climate patterns like El Nino. So just as a reminder, even the word El Nino, I think, is a little bit appropriated. Let's just remember that the El Nino comes from 17th century indigenous Chilean fishermen who recognized abnormalities in their fisheries, that when you had warm sea temperatures, you had less fish. And these warm temperatures weren't just warm all throughout the year, they were specifically during Christmas, the Christmas time, the coming of the Christ child. And that's where the word El Nino came from. Later, it was appropriated by climate scientists, along with the Walker circulation and the Southern Oscillation. Anyways, how do other people see this? So I was really interested in the vocabulary of how people of the Pacific view the word El Nino. And of course, El Nino is a climate pattern that has very regionally specific impacts. So for example, in the Western Pacific, right, the trade winds shift. And so what happens under normal conditions is you have sea level over their coral reefs. They have a flat top coral reef. During an El Nino, the water totally shifts, so it changes the sea level. What happens during an El Nino is the sea level drops and the top portions of those coral heads die off. And the Samoan people recognize that the lower sea level exposed their reefs, killing their stuff, and they call this period of time taimasa, which translates to kaimake, or dead oceans, because that is the smell of the rotting living things on the reef. And so that's how they interpreted it. And I wondered, in Hawaii, what are our words? What are our forms of multi-generational knowledge to describe this? So luckily we have Nupepa. These are newspapers in the Hawaiian language, and they are intentional repositories of customary knowledge. They were developed almost as soon as the missionaries landed up on here in 1820. The first newspapers came out in 1834. In fact, this comes from the very first newspaper, where the chiefs begged the people to put their knowledge in these newspapers. So once you pass away, traditional knowledge may disappear. The reason why it's important is because at this period of time, Hawaiians are still practicing their customary beliefs. So, you know, at this time, you have oral knowledge documented while customary practices are still widespread. And it occurred for over 100 years, over 100 different newspapers. So in effect, we have the largest documented archive for an indigenous people in the United States, for sure, because so much of indigenous culture is oral. So what does it look like? Can we look for this? We know from climatic records, it should be wetter than normal, higher seas, weaker trade winds. Remember, that's what I said happened in 2015, 2016, but it can also be drier than normal, drought, famine, low stream flow, but that happens in the winter. So you can see it's actually an opposite pattern. It's wetter and then it's drier, okay? This is what it looks like. We can then go to the newspapers and ask, what did our kupuna see? Were they describing, and match that up to what are historical reconstructions of El Nino. So these are historical reconstructions of El Nino. I'm just highlighting for you one particular time period, which is in the 1870s, because it's really, really important to Hawaii. So this is just one newspaper I'm highlighting. We looked at one newspaper, and we looked at how many events between 1869 and 1900 are people talking. What is the vocabulary that they're using? Okay. And what we found is, and we just decided to look for words that meant, the people were talking about rain or people were talking about drought. And what we noticed was we saw a decrease. So we're normalizing all the events. So if it's like average, it's going to be 1. If it's below average, it's going to be less than 1 on the low side. Or if people are talking more than average, it's going to be above 1. So during this period of time that I've highlighted that there is this historical El Nino based on the record, people were talking less about rain and more about drought. So I wanted to show to you, because this is actually an issue that is ongoing right now, happening. This is an article that really, really struck me. So these are not just quantifications that's happening in the newspaper. I go through and I actually read and translate these. This is an article from Maui. This is about Kaupo. There is crisis now in this land. The rain hasn't fallen and the land is parched, and it's as if God is keeping prosperity on this side of Kipahulu. So this is really amazing information. When I read the newspaper, it gives me specific geographic location. It gives me, descriptions. People are doing comparative analyses. The features of this land are not like before. It's as if it has been burned by fire. Makawao is dry. It gives you all this information. It hasn't been this dry in 30 years. And so what's really interesting, the reason why I pulled these is because these were written, and then the sugar planters used this very short span El Nino, right? Because in this collective memory, maybe they were not as connected. Maybe because of colonialism, they didn't have that. The intergenerational knowledge was being kind of broken up. They didn't have that intergenerational knowledge to know, don't worry, this is a cycle. It's bad. Yeah, it's really bad, but it's going to end. And because this El Nino was so bad, this was the impetus, actually, that Klaus Spreckles went to Kalakaua and demanded the very first diversions for sugar on Maui. And as we know today, diversions are a huge problem, and remain a source of contention for just regular everyday people trying to live their lives and have our culture really sustain. So these articles, when I read them, they give me chills because they're so much a reminder of the forces at play, and that when you have really bad conditions, but you don't know, you aren't connected to your ancestral knowledge source, you can make some really bad decisions that like continue to affect you generations later. I'm going to skip over this information, but I just wanted to end with the idea that what do we do? What do we do? How do we bring modern aloha aina back into the picture? How do we apply these hupuna practices today? I think it's important for us to recognize important places, important resources, and to really kind of prioritize, what are the things, the spaces and the places that we really want to maintain, that we need to restore, and maybe even the ones that we have to let go. And we really have to reapply aloha aina more in a modern context. I don't want to leave my talk off, but without sharing and bringing into the space, really, you heard of aloha aina way back in the identity of Native Hawaiians, and you heard about how aloha aina was redeployed during patriotism, and aloha aina is really what should inspire us moving forward. So I want to kind of like leave you with a video of one of the people who really rekindled the word aloha aina, so that we can redeploy it today.
It is an island that's sacred. It's the smallest of the major islands in the archipelago of Hawaii. After the war, the military got Kaho'olawe, and so they just kind of tried every ammunition, every bomb, every torpedo was tested on Kaho'olawe and was practiced there. When you hear that, it's like into your chest. I mean, it hurts after it started to hurt. Why you're doing this to the island? And people take it seriously. It's like doing it to me. So it was just the most devastating damage you'll ever see. It hurt us. One of the old saying is, take care of the land and the land takes care of you. The health of the land is the health of our people and actually the health of our nation. So we made a commitment to do something about it, and we were able to get the bombing stopped.
So that's really where I want to end for now, is that the redeployment of this idea of aloha aina really came from a place of Hawaiian people at the time feeling totally helpless at the destruction of their island. I mean, there was the physical destruction. And yet, from that place of depression, anxiety, and fear, we look back to the practice of our ancestors, and we're able to reclaim and reassert and regain hope. And I think that's really kind of some of the values that we have to do moving forward, is to look that. So I'm sorry I took up so much time. I wanna apologize to Kawika, and I'll
Don't be sorry at all. That was amazing. That was amazing, and you took us a long way in actually a relatively short period of time. So we thank you for that, and stand by. We have so far we only have one question, so we're not. I want to encourage the audience to put their questions into the chat so that we get to your interests. But want to also let our panelists, our thought leaders, know that there's no pressure on time. I think so. You're just fine. But we're anxious to hear from Kawika. Kawika?
Well, did you want to take that question now, or are we going to hold questions to the end?
We can hold questions till later.
Yep. Okay, great. Thank you, Rosie. That was a phenomenal presentation. I think we might dovetail nicely. So let me just get mine up on screen. Jeez. Okay, you guys see my slide all right?
We're good.
Okay. Well, thank you again so much for inviting me out to present to you folks. I think, you know, what Rosie talked about, she talked about some very poignant issues of our time. Climate change is real. It's easy to fall into despair and give up and say, why even try? But as Rosie said, we have experienced collapse before, and we're still here. So we're going to look at how we are going to continue on into the future. So Rosie talked a bit about our voyaging traditions of Pacific Islanders. You know, the culture of conservation and sustainability that we have built in Hawaii is founded on Indigenous and Native Hawaiian culture, which is why the IUCN came here in 2016 and brought the World Conservation Congress. And it's the reason why many around the world look to us today. Rosie already shared a bit about voyaging traditions. This is our contemporary, one of our most famous contemporary voyaging canoe, Hokule'a. And it's famous for around the world for circumnavigating the globe using forms of ancestral wayfinding, including celestial navigation. It's a replica of the ancient vessels of discovery that our ancestors used to find the most remote islands in the largest ocean on the planet a millennia before Europeans navigated into the Atlantic. Hokule'a is a symbol of indigenous intelligence. It's a symbol of the Hawaiian Renaissance, which started in the mid-1970s and continues to this very day. It represents a cultural awakening. It was built to prove that our ancestral stories of long-distance voyaging and discovery were not merely myths, but they are actually a part of one of the greatest feats in the history of humanity. Hokule'a represents a defiance of the colonizer narratives that depict Hawaiians as ignorant savages. It represents the value of indigenous knowledge in contemporary society. Hokule'a is also a vehicle to understand the abundance mindset, as opposed to the scarcity mindset that is the heart of conservation strategies of Pacific Islanders. It has always perplexed me how Pacific Islanders, whose worldviews were shaped by island ecosystems of limited resources, developed an abundance mindset, whereas conservationists who come here from continental systems of seemingly limitless resources have somehow come to embody a scarcity mindset. In my experience, conservationists who operate from a scarcity mindset might aim to prevent things like extinction, but they tend to see endangered species as something that will only ever be endangered. On the other hand, conservationists who operate from an abundance mindset can imagine a world where there are no longer any endangered species. In Hawaii, this comes from an ability to tap into ancestral memory, which allows us to see a time when we sustainably supported the same population as we have today using ancestral technologies of agroecology and aquaculture, and did so without driving our precious native species into extinction. Ultimately, an ability to do this comes from the kind of wisdom that Hokule'a brings to the world. Rosie discussed one of our proverbs, he wa'a he moku he wa'a, which means that an island is a canoe is an island, and it's this way of acknowledging that we have limited resources. So how are we not only going to survive, but thrive? Well, the lessons that Hokule'a teach us is that we can actually scale that up to think of our planet in the middle of our solar system and recognize that our planet is an island. So we have island Earth, and we have Aina Earth. This is all we have. So how do we develop that? How do we get back to an abundance mindset and chart a course into the future? Because another one of the amazing lessons that we have learned from Hokule'a is the knowledge that we can navigate by different stars to arrive at different destinations. So let's keep that in mind as we journey towards the conclusion of this talk. So the Star Wars fans in the audience will know what this is. It's the planet Coruscant. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, it was a capital planet of the Galactic Republic, a planet that was entirely covered by a city. This image gave us a view into the future of our planet if we continue the trajectory we're on now. While this image seems like Earth's inevitable future, there are some of us who have a different future in mind for our planet. If you're one of those people, then you'll be interested in the work that we're doing here in Hawaii, because it shows us there is an alternative path for the future of our planet. So here's just another image from Star Wars. I'm a fan, obviously, but the Star Wars super fans in the audience will know what this one. It's Yavin 4, home base of the Rebel Alliance during the time of the Evil Empire. The one where all the X-Wing fighters took off from to go destroy the Death Star. It was a space-age civilization that existed on a forested world. This one always made my heart happy. It gave me a new hope. The Star Wars pun. A New Hope was the name of the first Star Wars movie. Anyway, this is where you're supposed to laugh. Seriously, though, this is important because the ability of the human civilization to continue on this planet will hinge on whether or not we can figure out how to maintain the forests on our planet with the population that we have today. The good news is that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. So here are two envisionings for the future of our planet. The lessons that Hokulea teach us tell us that we can navigate by different stars to get to different destinations. So if given the choice, which future would you choose to navigate Earth towards? I think you can guess which one I'd rather have my descendants live on. But how do we get there? And who will be our navigators? If this looks like the trajectory that we're currently on, then how do we change it? I think it begins by switching out our navigator and choosing a different star. Indigenous societies have created sustainable civilizations in the past, and indigenous wisdom can be the star that can lead us back on that path if we let it. And Hawaii just happens to be one of the examples of this. So here's an idea that has been bouncing around in my head for a few years, the concept of eco-civilizations. This concept is not entirely new, but I haven't heard much out of it, much outside of state-sponsored propaganda coming out of China. Well, I was recently invited to contribute an article to Landscape magazine. So I took the opportunity to flesh out the idea of eco-civilizations a bit more, at least my perspective of them. It was just published back in April. It's free and open access, so you can feel free to check it out. But in it, I explored the differences between civilizations, as we learned about them in middle school, and eco-civilizations, which have been largely ignored by institutional education systems in America. So what is an eco-civilization? Listed here are the requisites of a civilization. To me, Hawaii in the era before European contact fits the bill. We had a socially stratified nation state with a human population upwards of 1 million people. And I have described it in this article as one of Earth's eco-civilizations. But one that would more accurately be called an eco-civilization. I'm sorry. So what are the differences between a regular civilization and an eco-civilization? Well, first, unlike the civilizations that you learned about in middle school, which were built through a centralized system of governance and resource management, the Hawaiian eco-civilization was built using a decentralized approach. Housing large human populations in cities, that's a centralized approach, and one that is inherently unsustainable. Cities function based on economic systems that rely on economies of scale, which leads to monotypic agriculture, which itself comes at the expense of forests and wetlands, habitats that perform critical services for the functioning of our environment and our climate. The development of cities was not an option in Hawaii prior to regular trans-Pacific shipments of food and other goods that began in the modern era. 250 years ago, Hawaii had a population the size that is approximate to today's population, but not a single city, and definitely not a second city in Kapolei. It's a joke for people in Hawaii. Anyway, how did they do this? A decentralized approach was the only option. Anciently, these islands were each divided into moku, or social ecological regions, and each of these were further subdivided into ahupua'a, or social ecological communities. And ahupua'a could only house as many humans as it could feed on its own. The islands were once divided up into nearly 2,000 ahupua'a, each having a sizable population, with the largest of these sustainably supporting several thousand people. This approach to civil engineering allowed the Hawaiian eco-civilization to sustain a large human population that was dispersed throughout the landscape rather than concentrated in major population centers. So how did these ahupua'a sustainably support 1 to several thousand people? It was through technological advancements in agroecology and aquaculture. Unlike the technological advancements in agriculture associated with regular civilizations that ultimately destroyed essential habitats like forests and wetlands in the pursuit of food production, the agroecology and aquaculture employed by eco-civilizations were designed with a conservation ethic, and they maintain these essential habitats in the process of increasing food production. Then there is literacy, but there are many forms of literacy. And the environmental literacy of indigenous peoples allowed them to use ecomimicry to solve the problems associated with their growing population. And in eco-civilizations, economic systems were regenerative and circular, like the one here in Hawaii that mimicked the water cycle. I think you get the idea, but do check out the article if you're interested in learning more. So what does any of this have to do with our conversation today? Well, the manners in which we weave science and spirituality put us on a certain trajectory, as Rosie was alluding to. And this is where indigenous stewardship comes in. And Hawaii has a lot to teach the world in this regard. So I will eventually get into the topics of biocultural restoration and Hawaiian agroecology and aquaculture systems a bit more, as well as community-based fishery management. But before I get into those things, I need to lay a bit of a foundation. So as I mentioned earlier, our islands were divided. The largest divisions of land are called moku on our islands. And picture here is just one of our islands, Kauai, where I lived and worked for a time and continue to conduct research. So you can see in this island, each of the colored areas are moku. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5 on this island. So we had an idea that these divisions are not just arbitrary and they're not just political, but they're actually founded in the ecology of the islands, and they are ecologically aligned. So a colleague and I did some modeling, and we found out that these moku are the boundaries of these moku are actually ecologically aligned. So here we looked at temperature and solar radiation and rainfall, and we found there were indeed significant differences in the ecology in the environments of these moku. So we're going to look at one of these moku, Hale'le'a, where I was living and working. And we're going to look at that and see how that was further divided into social ecological communities. So these moku are the social ecological regions, but within each region, there are many communities. So this is Hale'le'a from the perspective of looking north, looking south. But it's really important to recognize that human nature relationships are the foundation of this indigenous system of resource management that existed here for about a millennium. And we refer to this as the moku system. Ancient knowledge keepers designed a system of indigenous resource management that employed conservation strategies that were shaped by 5 millennia of living in island systems prior to arriving in Hawaii. This system of indigenous resource management was based on relationships to place, relationships to biodiversity, and relationships to environmental forces. Having been developed within the abundance mindset that I spoke of earlier, it managed for abundance within the context of limited island systems, which is no small feat. This state of sustainable resource abundance is termed aina momona. Under this system of resource management, there were no extinctions, there were no endangered species, and there were no catastrophic wildfires. There was almost perpetual abundance. So how did this happen? Well, it certainly wasn't easy, and it definitely wasn't magic. But at the end of the day, it was about relationships between people and place. So again, within this context of Omoku, this highlighted region that's pictured here on the right, it was divided into communities that we call ahupua'a. And these communities tended to run from the mountains to the ocean. But it's really important that within each community, there were these zones. So this lower zone, the reddish, orangish in the lower elevations, those are the areas of human habitation, agroecology, and things like that. And above that, there's the forest. But there wasn't just one kind of forest. It wasn't just where humans live and then the forest. There were many different kinds of forests that were tended to and managed or reserved for different things. So you have your timber forest and your remote forest, which is left to maintain ecological processes, and then the sacred forest, which is at the tops of these areas. The sacred forests are the places for the refugia for our precious endemic biodiversity, our plants and our birds. So within this context, resources were managed, but cultural resources, natural resources, same thing in Hawaii, were managed horizontally and vertically. And so the connectivity of biodiversity, which is really important to maintain abundance of cultural resources, was managed across in the horizontal across the moku, or the region. And within a single ahupa'a, managed vertically, were water, nutrients, and sediment. So here's an image from a different ahupa'a, different island, but keeping the theme going. As I said now, for my day job, I actually didn't say this too much, but I am a research professor, and I run a fairly large research program through the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. Within this context, unlocking ecological foundations of indigenous resource management is a primary interest of mine as a research scientist. And I would be remiss if I didn't weave some of this work in. So I'll share a bit about some of the work that is relevant here. As we described in one of our theoretical ecology papers in 2020, and Rosie was a really important co-author on that, indigenous environmental literacy led to an implementation of various eco-mimicry strategies within the Hawaiian system of resource management that sustainably fed upwards of 1 million people in these islands while maintaining, not destroying, important habitats such as forests, wetlands, and estuaries. Using the site of our research reserve as a model, we described how natural wetlands were converted into wetland agroecosystems that functioned as sediment retention basins that grew food. Indigenous aquaculture systems were integrated into this food system and acted as nutrient retention basins that grew fish. You can see one pictured here. It's a darker circle at the bottom of this image. And it's not that color because the water is deeper, but because it supported a beneficial phytoplankton bloom. This managed phytoplankton bloom catalyzed a trophic chain reaction that then increased an abundance of fish. And then the water flowing out of this system to the coral reefs was clean and maintained good coral health. So in my mind, these aquaculture systems, or local Heʻeia, which are colloquially referred to as fish ponds, are, to me at least, a quintessential example of how indigenous knowledge can help us to navigate building a global eco-civilization. Hawaiian aquaculture systems are unique. These approaches to aquaculture are certainly not found anywhere else in the Pacific and maybe even the world. So we know that these large-scale systems were a novel technology that was developed here in Hawaii. And the archaeological records points to a period of about 800 years ago that these were constructed. Some of the older stories from the island of Molokai speak about this indigenous technology tracing back anciently to generations of observations of the migratory and spawning patterns of fishes, coupled with the knowledge of environmental parameters in coastal waters, which in turn led to ideas of habitat augmentation that would allow these systems to function as phytoplankton incubators that catalyze this trophic chain reaction, and then resulted in our reefs producing more fish than they could on their own. Imagine that, a reef producing more fish than it could without the presence of humans. An ability to create such a technology comes from an abundance mindset. At the height of the Hawaiian eco-civilization, there were more than 100 fish ponds like this, the one pictured here, and this one is 88 acres, and thousands of smaller fish ponds that were just a fraction of an acre. And these systems played a key role in supporting a population of upwards of 1 million people. But by the end of the 20th century, there were no functioning fish ponds. Most destroyed or filled in for development, with the rest laying in ruin. And about 90% of Hawaii's food was shipped in to support a population of 1 million people. But we are now 3 generations into a resurgence of indigenous culture known as the Hawaiian Renaissance. Indigenous perspectives, practices, and knowledge systems are coming back into the mainstream, and they are the foundation of various efforts in the realms of conservation and sustainability, described as biocultural restoration. So I want to pause here for a bit to just talk about the Hawaiian Renaissance. Hawaiian Renaissance starting in mid-70s, as I said earlier, and continuing on through today. Here's a timeline that we published a few months back, looking at parallels between these resurgence of cultural movements, such as language revival, the Hokulea, the birth of Hokulea and its many voyages, and Koho'olawe, the island that Rosie ended her talk on, the efforts to protect and restore that island. And we looked at the parallels. So those are on the bottom side of the timeline. On the top top half of the timeline are some community-based efforts in 3 of Hawaii's leading communities who are engaged in biocultural restoration. You don't need to see the words here, but the point is that there's a growth and an evolution of what's happening at a place-based level, and growth of evolution of what's happening at across the archipelago cultural level, in terms of revival and revitalization of Hawaiian ways of knowing and Hawaiian ways of being. So this is where within that context, we can have a conversation about biocultural restoration, which, so one of the ways that we can think of, when we think of colonization, that process that Rosie spent a bit of time on, we can think about it as a process that results in the severing of relationships of indigenous peoples to their lands and their waters, severing their ancestral lifeways. And then you can think about biocultural restoration as the antidote. As I described a couple years back, biocultural restoration focuses on restoring the relationships between indigenous people and their places, as well as between them and the biodiversity that shaped the languages and identities of their ancestors. Biocultural restoration is built on the notion that everything in the system is interconnected, as are the problems we perceive and the solutions to them. So in Hawaii, when we think about biocultural restoration, we kind of go back to this more ancestral way of thinking, of viewing the land within these regions, moku, and within these ahupua'a, knowing that things extend from the mountains to the sea, and they're all one system. And in the process of doing this, recognizing the personhood, quote unquote, which is not the word that I'm completely in love with, but it's one that's trending nowadays. But recognizing the personhood of everything around us helps us to build deeper relationships, deeper connections through our relationships. And so this is where indigenous mapping comes in, because through indigenous mapping, we're able to use more modern technologies such as this to overlay ancestral forms of mapping, such as place names. And when we bring back these place names, we can speak to the land again, speak to the aina again, using the name that the ancestors used, and start to redevelop or rebuild a relationship on that foundation. And in the process of doing so, we've been restoring cultural landscapes. We've been restoring our indigenous food systems. A lot of this work starts with removal of invasive species. So in a different community here on Oahu, where my research reserve is located, mangroves were introduced in 1922 as a band-aid solution to the increased sedimentation associated with the shift from indigenous agroecology to commercial agriculture. But then they weren't managed, and over the course of almost 100 years, they started taking over the wetland and the rest of the estuary around it. They pushed native fishes and native birds out of the area and facilitated a population boom for invasive fishes and birds. Elsewhere in the wetland, invasive grasses from Asia and Africa started taking over with the same effect. A little more than 20 years ago, mangrove removal started across the street of this picture at the fish pond, and efforts to remove the invasive grasses started in the wetland on the other side. And this is what's been the community has been restoring in its place. With the invasive mangroves and grasses removed, the community could now restore the indigenous infrastructure. Fish pond walls across the street, and as pictured here, the banks and the berms and the irrigation canals associated with wetland agroecology. And this is what biocultural restoration looks like: a modern landscape that is sustaining communities through a deep relationship to place. But our relationship to place didn't end at the shoreline. It extended out into the ocean. And I know we're running short on time, so I'm gonna be speeding it up a bit. But one of the efforts, so there's various forms of community-based efforts to manage nearshore waters based on indigenous ways of stewardship. And one of the manifestations of this is community-based fishing areas, or CBSFAs. And so pictured here is Heʻeia CBSFA, the first fully enacted CBSFA in the world, third to be designated in Hawaii, but first to be fully enacted. And what this does is a community-based subsistence fishing area prioritizes the traditions of the community of feeding itself from the reef. It doesn't prioritize protecting fishes for tourists to look at. It doesn't prioritize commercial fishing in the area. It prioritizes the community caring for the reef so it could feed itself, so that their grandchildren's grandchildren could continue to feed themselves from the reef. So in the process, we're starting to see that an empowering of indigenous stewardship benefits everyone. So Rosie talked about Aloha Aina, the foundations of it, Aina being the center of everything, the land, the relationships that people have with land, and loving the land. But from this love of the land, Aloha Aina flows into a desire to care for the land, and that's called Malama Aina here in Hawaii. So when you come to Hawaii, you're going to hear some of these terms, Aloha Aina, Malama Aina. But because of this deep relationship to Aina, if our Aina is threatened, we're going to protect it, and that's called Kia'i Aina. And these are various forms of indigenous agency that all flow out of this relationship to place. So the world is beginning to recognize that the effective conservation does not happen without the involvement of indigenous people. In fact, there are many examples of highly effective conservation projects and programs that are indigenous designed, indigenous led, and government supported. The terms of art for these approaches are collaborative management and or biocultural restoration, and Hawaii is a leader in that regard. So how do we get from an ahupua'a to a global civilization, bringing this full circle? It begins with empowering indigenous stewardship and looking to indigenous knowledge to shift to an abundance mindset in our conversations about sustainability and conservation. I hope that the folks watching this around the country will join us on this journey, because in a world where it seems like everything is falling apart, indigenous stewardship offers us hope for the future. So thank you so much.
Wow, thank you, Kawika and Rosie. You want to come back on screen? There we are. Wonderful presentations today, and we're fine on time. We have a couple questions we want to get to right away. One from Aotearoa, where it's Saturday morning at the other corner of Moanuiakiwa, Kelly Dombrowski. Love your work here, highlights the natural alignment between indigenous sciences and mataulana and geography, crossing cultural and physical geography. And I'm not sure you folks can answer this, but I think it's something, a question we like your feelings about, as well as something we leave with AAG. So what further connections do you think will emerge at the conference? And you've shown some slides of Heʻeia, for instance, that I'm most certain is going to be one of the site visits available to conferees. But could you offer some thoughts about what you think ought to be, the conferees ought to take advantage of while they're here, and what connections they ought to be making?
Sure, I'll start. I think that a really important place would be to kind of understand the different perspectives that Indigenous geographers bring to a lot of the topics and the questions. I think that being immersed in Hawaii will allow that to come forward. There are a number of Indigenous geographers. We're friends with them. We think they're wonderful, and their ideas should really come to the fore. And then being in this place that has inspired those perspectives, I think will allow for those conversations to flow. I think from there, we can see what are the places of convergence in other areas that people are studying. That's my first. I mean, I think really allowing Indigenous geographers to kind of set the stage, set the tone for some of the ideas and themes that are being discussed at the conference.
Kawika, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just add that I think in a lot of these conferences, I think Rosie and I are more used to going to climate change kind of conferences and conservation kinds of conferences, but quite often there's this a sense of urgency and there's a sense of panic, and where the people who have gathered know the future that's coming and are not in denial about that, and quite often don't know what to do. So I'm not quite sure how geographers are looking at how climate change is going to be affecting the world, and how geographers see themselves as a part of the solution. But like as Rosie was saying, I'll double down on that, is take the opportunity to learn from indigenous geographers wherever you go, whether it be Hawaii or elsewhere, and get their perspective, and help maybe use that indigenous wisdom to calibrate the work that you're doing and you're engaging in, so that we can position this discipline as a part of the solution for the future.
Hey, Rosie, you were talking about research you were doing early this morning, which is kind of the engagement of the academy and our scientists and knowledge holders with the people on the land. So how does that work? Have you created, what are the basis for that partnership that you've created?
Well, the basis for the partnership is relationships. These folks are people that in some cases I've grown up with. And so I went away to school, but when I came back, I was really looking for, I'll tell you the true story. The true story is I was looking for a place to do my research in a very Western point of view. I was like, I'm looking for a field site. And I kind of did my research and I thought, oh, estuaries seem to be a really good place for me to do my very kind of like question, my sampling. And I said, oh, who do I know? Who do I know in these spaces? I said, oh, one of my good friends from high school, he runs this fish pond. I had never been to Heʻeia fish pond, that beautiful place. And my friend Kelly said, you should come down. Let's just walk around and see what you can see. And I was like, okay. But in my head, I was very focused. I'm looking for locations and sites where I'm going to take water. It was a very extractive one-way point of view. And as soon as I got there, and I'm going to use a swear word, I immediately said to myself, wow, Rosie, you're being such an asshole. What the hell are you thinking? And I just had to take breaths. And immediately as I was walking around, it's very easy to connect with that place. So I'm glad that you're going to have the opportunity to go there. But I had to take a breath and like really assess my self-capacity, my self-awareness of where I was. As soon as I did that, I was able to release myself from this mindset. And I'll be honest, that visit changed the course of my life. It changed the course of my research. It changed the very nature of the way that I do research. I'll be honest and say the way that I train my students is to view research as ceremony. That might sound very controversial, but science is our practice, like our customer is our practice. And the way that I spoke about how our ancestors create knowledge is the way that I have come to grips with that. And that very much involves direct engagement, co-design and co-production with our community partners. And really they're our partners and they're collaborators. We meet with them early, often. It's an iterative process. We go through co-review, and we really believe that the information that we collect belongs to that place, to that people. So we really challenge the Western notions of data ownership. We think of it as data stewardship. And, these are potentially, I'm seeing some of the questions, these are some of the questions that can be taken up in this conference is, what is the data, some of the GIS maps, what is the responsibility of the people who are creating that data and that information to the places from which they come from? What are the benefits that this information is providing to those people? How is it increasing their agency and their ability to adapt to climate change, or to, fulfill whatever other commitments or dreams that their communities and their organizations have? So perhaps that's another way that they can engage.
I want to follow up on. I want Kawika to respond as well, but I also want to follow up on something. So if you're reaching out to indigenous peoples to access that knowledge, at what point have you crossed the line into appropriating that knowledge? And how do you avoid that risk? How do you manage that risk?
Yeah, well, so being an indigenous Hawaiian myself, you might think, how can I appropriate? And it's very easy. It's because a lot of this information is place-based. And my criterion for figuring out whether or not I'm appropriating something is, Who is with me? Is a person of this place with me, or am I speaking for somebody else? So that's a really easy, just initiatives in general. If you're trying to do something to improve the lot of a certain community and you don't have that community represented in the leadership, that's usually a good criteria of if you might be appropriating something, or maybe speaking for someone else that you shouldn't be speaking for.
Thank you, Rosie. Kawika, I want to invite you in on that subject, as well as we've encouraged people to come to Hawaii and think about what they might learn here that applies elsewhere. Well, your very role in a national research reserve suggests that there is an interest in this. And so what is the value that the people in NOAA or the people at the federal level see in the work that's going on here in Hawaii?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'll get to that in a bit, but I just want to touch on, just follow up with something Rosie said earlier about how she showed up in place. She didn't show up there like that because that's the kind of person she is. She's actually a really amazing person, but that's how institutions of higher education trained her to be. And so I think it's really important to recognize that. I think all of us who are parts of institutions of higher learning, I think we see ourselves as building knowledge and doing good things in the world, but it takes more than good intentions to actually end up with good results. And it's really how you approach your work, how you approach your places. Do you view a place, like how Rosie was trained to look at it, as a place to extract data and knowledge and build my career on top of that? But there's a bunch of us who have been recognizing that that's not the best way to do it. Let's flip that. Let's position ourselves as researchers in supporting places. How do we conduct research that supports the needs of the place and the needs of the people of place? It's different. It's a different model. It's completely flipping it. And so anyway, I wanted to address that. What was your actual question?
Well, there's a national interest in the work that's
right.
going
So
on
exactly.
there.
So
That's
yeah,
your
national
role.
interest. Yes. So the Biden administration last year put out an executive memo about engaging indigenous knowledge in research, policymaking, and these kinds of things, and which was great. We have this air cover from the highest echelons of the U.S. government now supporting these things. But yet then you have these departments and divisions in government that say, okay, but how? We need tangible models to look to show us how this can be done. And in that sense, the National Estuarine Research Reserve is a system of 30 estuarine research reserves around the country. And we're trying to leverage Hawaii as not the model, but as a model about how you can actually meaningfully engage indigenous knowledge in research, policy, and decision making.
Great. Thank you. Let's get to another question from our attendees. It seems the abundance mindset and other principles you've mentioned could lead to creative reimagining of the coastlines currently being reshaped by climate change, and to see the opportunity to bring these tidal areas back into harmony. Can you suggest directions, contacts, ideas for geographers to connect with to help with this reimagining?
Well, I'll jump in. It looks like Rosie's thinking, but as Rosie was showing these pictures of Waikiki, and she mentioned briefly, this actually used to be a wetland, and it was a wetland that was filled with wetland agroecology, like those pictures that I showed, and inland fish ponds, local Hawaii, and things like that. And then in 1922 or something, they drained it with that canal that they call the Alawai, and they drained the wetland and developed the coastal areas. But I think from the Native Hawaiian perspective, the thing was always a wetland. And the thing in a lot of people's minds, it's going to be a wetland again eventually. And so now it's happening. And so I think this is might be where geographers can come in, about understanding as these things transition back to wetlands, how can we start to reimagine? And so I think everybody knows that the devastation that's happened in Lahaina, and the fires, and I think a lot of people who have been following it will know that there's a lot of people that have been pointing out that, well, actually Lahaina used to be a wetland. What happened to those waters? They were diverted and it was drained. And so as we go through all of these climate disasters, it's an opportunity to rebuild and to rethink how we're going to do this. And so I lived through one of the first climate disasters that hit Hawaii in 2018. We had a rain bomb drop 55 inches of rain in 24 hours in this community of northern Kauai that I was highlighting. And things got destroyed. Houses got washed away. Roads got washed out. There were landslides. But an archaeologist friend of mine pointed out, he said, "Hey, did you ever notice the things that got destroyed were only the things that were built in the last 30 years? And if you look at all of the indigenous agriculture infrastructure, that's all still there." So it's an opportunity. And as the community of Haena we rebuilt trying to more come into alignment with that indigenous civil engineering. So it's an opportunity for Lahaina to do the same, and hopefully that'll happen. But I think the role of geographers is to maybe help envision a world where we can get back to this more space that as we're rebuilding, we're reincorporating wetlands, we're regrowing our forests as we rebuild our communities.
Rosie, would you want to add on that?
Sure. I absolutely agree with what Kawika's saying. I think that a lot of the destruction that we're seeing is the result of kind of imagining in which man was being set up in opposition to nature, that we had to conquer nature, that we had to we're going to divert this stream, we're going to change the flow of this river so that we can create this society that we need. And that was an approach, but I think we're rapidly seeing that approach was very short-sighted in terms of where the system, kind of where the baseline equilibrium of the system was, or within that period of time. And I think for whatever, I think that does, I have very strong feelings about where that all, where the inception of that happened during the Enlightenment. And I think that we have to unlearn that so that we can kind of go back to, and so I think, the saying that I was sharing, "Ikawama mua, kawama hope," it's not about us being backwards. It's not about us being anti-technology. In fact, what we're doing is we're choosing the technologies, choosing to rebuild the technologies and innovate upon the technologies that are more in alignment with Earth's systems, as opposed to kind of just laid on top and are not kind of entwined or aligned with it. And so the role of geographers, I also agree with Kawika that it's to expand, expand the epistemological framework from which we're drawing upon it. I think that would be a really powerful role for geographers to do, is to expand the epistemologies around how we think about it, and then how do we implement it.
I suspect most of the 6,000 attendees at this conference will not make it to Lahaina. It's a difficult place to be in at this point and bear that kind of impact of visitation. But they'll be in Waikiki, and when I think Lahaina is really going to serve as a model for how you rebuild and how you address when you're in the wake of climate change disaster. How do you restore some of the systems? But at the same time, that the counter pressure will be on the restoration and protection of investment. That picture you showed of Waikiki inundated is massive loss of investment. And my knowledge of investors is they're going to want to protect that. And I've never been to New Orleans, but I imagine there'll be people advancing ideas of dikes and pumps and so forth to keep their investment high and dry in the face of a relentless pressure from the planet to take back the wetlands and restore the wetlands that once was there. What's that conversation going to be like, and how do geographers fit into that?
Well, just from my full disclosure, I sit on the Honolulu City County Climate Change Commission as the chair, and thankfully these discussions are already happening. We have a very well networked together Waikiki Watershed Alliance. Hotel industries are definitely thinking about this. I don't know if it's driven so much by wanting to restore the wetlands as protecting, their economic investment and avoiding risk. But these conversations are happening. I can tell you what's not a great imagining is the idea that yes, we're going to restore wetlands, but still keep the golf courses, and those are literally conversations that I've heard, like, oh yeah, it'll be fine. We can still have the Alawai golf course and, we'll also have Lo'ikalo. And that doesn't seem like the right solution. I think we really have to genuinely interrogate and redefine ourselves what that looks like. I mean, it's going to be, a complete reimagining. It really has to be really deep. Do we want the kinds of economies that we currently have to persist? If we do, is it a question of moving them to another location? What are the benefits and risks to those communities where those locations are now being sited and potentially developed in? A huge investment. I would really encourage the attendees. I think it would be really fabulous actually if we could partner with some folks at Sea Grant. I'm thinking of Dolan Eversole, who has a really kind of broad view of how Waikiki has really been. It's hard to call it a beach. It's actually an engineered coastline so that it can be maintained for the purpose of tourism. And that is a really interesting prospect of engineering a coastline for a purpose of that. And that's a question that I think, would be really interesting to see external views of geographers, come to bear on that. Because that is something that the question is, are we going to now manufacture and engineer something like this elsewhere because we cannot maintain it in Waikiki?
Yeah.
It's a really interesting question.
We're getting on time, kind of right at time. But Kawika, you have a thought about this that you want to add as a closing comment?
I think, like I was saying during the course of my talk, is an abundance mindset. How do we make this a part of the conversation as you folks are here? How do we help to shift the conversation that's happening on the planet out of a scarcity mindset into abundance mindset? I'd be really curious to see what geographers think that might look like.
Well, I'm sure they'll be engaged on that question. So thank you very much for both of you. And Rosie, your slides in particular kind of left us a little bit wary about the future. And I just want to kind of add this sobering and hopefully uplifting note. 25 years ago, Heʻeia was a really different place. The place that you both do very important work was in serious disrepair, dysfunction as an ecosystem, as well as disruptive in terms of community relationships. That has changed remarkably in 25 years. So we can make change, and you two have very much been a part of that. And on that hopeful note, we want to close, although we've got another question here. Let me see. Many of the indigenous colleagues from the mainland have told me they are unsure about coming to this conference because of mixed messaging regarding its appropriateness. Example, conferences as expression of colonialism and appropriation. My sense from speaking with geographers here is that there is a profound desire to make this conference a game changer in how it operationalizes and indigenizes the conference experience. My hope is this is a true, and my feeling is that it is. So that's not so much a question, but a really fine note to end on that I think we've established with our webinars and those that we've talked to here in Hawaii, who are part of the AAG as well as in fields like yours that are very much related, that people are welcome here. But they're welcome here not to kind of bring the old ideas, but to really explore new thinking about how they might approach their profession. So that's all the time we have. We'll be having more webinars. I think the next ones are going to be in the month of November. We have scheduled. So thank you very much for joining us today. And these will be recorded and put on the website. So it's not just those who participated directly, but as people register for the conference, they'll be able to get access to the webinar series. And boy, I hope they see this one. So thank you, Rosie. Thank you, Kawika, for being here. And thank you to the audience for your engagement in this webinar. Until the next one, aloha no.
Mahalo, aloha.
Aloha.